right before Passover, and the issue of humanitarian aid and Israel's legal obligations was once again in the Israeli headlines. Reports suggested that Israel might renew the entry of aid into the Gaza Strip after having halted shipments at the start of March. This is a good time for us to look at a special, never-released episode with Professor Avi Bell on the problems with the key organization managing the distribution of aid in Gaza. I'm Aylana Meisel, and this is Basic Law. As of the filming of this new episode, Israel is once again at a decision point. In the balance, the desire to apply pressure to Hamas to release the remaining Israeli captives, the need to protect Israeli and Gazan lives by weakening Hamas, and the desire to minimize collateral damage of the war within Gaza. Above all, figuring out a way to ensure that any aid that does enter the Strip isn't diverted to Hamas. COGAT, the IDF authority coordinating the work of aid organizations within Gaza, has stated that it has introduced a vetting mechanism to ensure that aid is not being diverted to Hamas, but details on this are scant. With the issue of humanitarian aid to Gaza looming large once again, let's look at UNRWA as a case study. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East has been presented for years as a vital humanitarian organization, funneling international aid to millions of Palestinians in Gaza, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. But years' worth of evidence have shown extensive coordination with and penetration by terrorist groups, to the point where UNRWA's schools have spread terrorist ideology. Its institutions have housed weaponry, and some of its employees even directly participated in the atrocities of October 7th. When this episode was originally filmed, Israeli laws had just gone into effect banning the operations of UNRWA in Israeli sovereign territory and outlawing all official contact between UNRWA and Israeli state agencies. To this day, that law remains only partially implemented, and beyond that, UNRWA continues to operate in the Gaza Strip. Despite its proven cooperation, occasionally with terrorist organizations, and the cessation of American backing, this billion-dollar organization still operates with the support of the EU and countries such as Germany, Sweden, France, and Canada. What lessons should Israel learn about its approach to this and other humanitarian aid organizations with questionable credentials? And for that matter, how should the international community rethink its aid decisions? So, check out the episode, and happy Passover to those who celebrate. To unpack these issues, we're joined by Professor Avi Bell, an expert in international law and intellectual property at San Diego and Bar-Ilan Universities. Professor Bell is a fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum, and he also serves on the board of directors of NGO Monitor. He also leads the Israel Law and Liberty Forum's summer seminar on law and democracy. Avi, welcome to the new show.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the basics on UNRWA. $1.5 billion annually, including tax dollars from many Western democracies, 30,000 employees throughout Jerusalem, Gaza, Judea and Samaria, Lebanon, and Syria. What exactly is UNRWA? What does it do? How's it financed? And what has the impact been on the populations it's meant to serve?
Okay, so UNRWA is an organization that stands for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. It was an agency, it wasn't created to be an agency, it was created to be a small service taking care of refugees of all ethnicities during the 1948 Israeli War of Independence. But then it turned into this gigantic operation over the years. Now, UNRWA is now an organization that has two central roles. One of them is that it delivers services. It delivers services to Palestinians. It calls the service recipients Palestine refugees. Mm-hmm. But the way they define Palestine refugees is more or less, it means the descendant of anyone who was resident for the 2 years prior to the outbreak of war in 1948 and lost a home or business as a result. And, of course, the primary number of Palestine refugees is minuscule these days, right? Most people who lost home in 1948 have long since departed this earth. It's about their descendants. And the idea is not just to get the descendants, but to get anyone who presents a coupon, because the definition Palestine refugee entitles you to services, UNRWA has been very generous in handing out coupons even to people who apparently don't fit the definition. And it's been very reluctant to take people off the rolls so that they end up enjoying services past their death. That is, their family members get to take the money. But there's a second role of UNRWA. It's not simply to provide services. The other thing that UNRWA does is it's a political organization that promotes an extreme line on politics related to the Palestinians. And maybe the easiest way to see this is UNRWA, by its very existence, according to Article 1 of the Refugee Convention, strips all Palestinians of the right to any of the rights that refugees have in international law. And it's part of the general strategy behind UNRWA, which is more or less to create political suffering for the Palestinians in order to maintain an anti-Israel line, to put political blame on Israel and then to advance anti-Israel measures. UNRWA also pursues this political line at a lower level. It does this through its schools, in which it promotes radicalism among Palestinians, Palestinian students, Palestinian children. Right? And it also does this at a global level, where it puts out endless propaganda against Israel. Perhaps the most bizarre and interesting one was a few years ago. The spokesperson for UNRWA, his name was Chris Gunnis, a fanatical and bizarre individual, put on a one-man theater show, I'm a Warehouse, in which he was play acting a warehouse that was bombed by Israel. Right? Just bizarre propaganda.
We could spend probably half an hour talking about what it takes to play a warehouse. But let me just wrap up the first question about, so who's funding UNRWA, and to the extent that it does provide services, is it actually doing a good job for the population it's responsible for?
So UNRWA, like other UN organizations, it's created by the General Assembly. It's funded out of a budget that the General Assembly decides. And that means it's pretty much dependent on the voluntary contributions of state members of the UN. Now, a lot of states kick in. The United States kicked in for many years, inconceivably, but that is what's happened. And UNRWA is a fairly inefficient and corrupt service provider. This has been written about for many years. There was an interesting report by the former general counsel of UNRWA, James Lindsay, back in 2009, in which he highlighted the problem with the way that UNRWA delivers services. And back then already, he identified that one of the problems was that the workers' union in UNRWA was controlled by Hamas, right? That is, it's always been controlled by the terrorist organizations, and that's the way that in Gaza, the way it's used is as cover for terrorist organization operations. The delivery of services is purely secondary.
So Israel has claimed at this point that UNRWA is just completely penetrated by Hamas and other extremist organizations. The UN has only partially agreed. And that's following an internal investigation into the agency's operations, in which at least some of the employees that were said to have participated in October 7th were dismissed. But the organization does actively maintain relationships with terror organizations in various countries in which it works, I think, because it feels that it needs to, or it should. It certainly hasn't hidden it. And so given that, I'm wondering whether you can just talk about some of the most blatant examples of that kind of coordination.
This is something that has been talked about for many, many years. Mm-hmm. Right? And so in the old days, 20 years ago, when people were talking about the problem that UNRWA has been taken over by terrorist organizations, primarily what Israel would talk about is the fact that the workers at UNRWA are Hamas members and they're using Hamas facilities. And UNRWA had a very simple response, which was, we don't check the political affiliations of our workers, as if being a member of a terrorist organization is, like joining the Republican Party. And so it's a political affiliation. It's not our business. And this is the excuse that they used over the years. What shook things up a little bit was that in the wake of the atrocities of October 7th, videos came out of UNRWA employees taking part, that is, going over the fence with flak jackets and weapons, and clearly taking an active part in the looting and pillaging and raping and murdering and torturing and all the other atrocities that were performed on October 7th. This is a real problem for them. So UNRWA then said, "Oops, sorry, we didn't. We'll fire these guys," as if it's a small thing. But it's not. It turns out that it's not a small thing. So UN Watch did a couple of interesting reports on UNRWA. And so one of the things that it uncovered was it went through the chat groups of UNRWA employees, and it turns out that the general sentiment of the employees is slaughter the Jews. It's not the 19 members that Israel named that were participating in October 7th. No. We're talking about the rank and file. And again, this shouldn't be surprising because, as James Lindsay reported in 2009, Hamas controls the worker unions of UNRWA. It's not as if there's marginal support for Hamas. It's complete support for Hamas. But it's not just that. UN Watch put out a second report, even more devastating, in which it documented the meetings between senior terrorists and senior officials in UNRWA. They're coordinated. Their activities are coordinated. And so this adds to all the reports we've had over the years in which UNRWA facilities have been used to help Hamas. Hamas locates weaponry inside UNRWA schools. Hamas has control centers inside UNRWA schools, and now we discover that Hamas was holding hostages inside UNRWA schools. And so it's penetrated through and through. What you can basically look at UNRWA as little more than a fig leaf for Hamas.
You're saying that this is information that's been around for a long time. Why are we just doing something about it now? And now that we're doing something about it, it looks like the implementation is imperfect. So why is it even taking so long for that to really take effect?
So, let's understand, what does it mean by that we're doing something, and what else could have been done? So Israel recently passed a law that forbids in Israeli territory the operations of UNRWA, soliciting money, carrying out any activities, carrying out any meetings, etc. Right? A complete ban on UNRWA. It's only in the area of Israeli law, meaning that over the Green Line, UNRWA can continue operating. In Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, Israel can continue operating.
But not
and it doesn't.
Not in contact with Israeli state agencies.
Right, but they're already on the ground. They already have facilities. They already have money. They already have workers' unions that are controlled by Hamas. They're already there doing their mischief. So this is a fairly limited step. Okay. Now it's an obvious step, but it's a fairly limited step. The other steps that have been discussed over the years has been attempts to get the UN to exercise greater oversight, which is rather a joke because that's asking the cat to guard the milk. And attempts to dissuade donors from donating to UNRWA, which is also futile because I think that those who donate to UNRWA are doing so because it wages a political battle against Israel. And they're willing to exercise willful blindness towards UNRWA connections with terrorism, as they have over the years. So there are more things that can be done, and you're right about this particular law has not been fully implemented. That is, it turns out there still are UNRWA facilities in Israel. The law just took effect several weeks ago, but there still are UNRWA facilities openly operating in Israel. And it's not entirely clear why that's happened. It may be a question of enforcement priorities, and it may be that the Israeli bureaucracy is dragging its feet. But the truth is that this is not the most important step to be taken against UNRWA. To me, the most important step to be taken against them is to assign to them criminal and civil liability for their material support for terrorism, right? That is, UNRWA employees should be arrested and tried, right? They should be personally sued for their support for terrorism. Now, here we have a problem because they have the cover of the UN. They enjoy UN immunity. And to get to them in lawsuits, to arrest them, will require piercing that immunity. And this is a little bit tricky. You know, there's litigation going on right now in the United States, civil suits against UNRWA employees for their participation in terrorism. And as of right now, we're stuck because the Biden administration was quite active in protecting the immunity of UNRWA, the UN immunity. And so, you know, it's not clear how to proceed. And I have to point out one other landmine that's out there. There is a treaty that covers UN facilities in every country and UN immunity. And that treaty says in cases of dispute, the dispute goes to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, in The Hague. And so it's fairly clear that a dispute over that will end up in the ICJ, and the ICJ will issue judgments against the Jewish state as it does.
This is the step that should be taken, but it is unlikely that Israel will do it, and that if it does it, that they'll have any practical effect at the end of it.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that, but the steps, taking these steps involves a lot of risk, diplomatic and otherwise, and it's unsurprising that Israel has moved slowly. There are no obvious wins ahead that Israel has given up. It's more along the lines of there are steps Israel can take, but every one of them is potentially quite costly and may not succeed. And so Israel's proceeded cautiously, maybe too cautiously. Maybe there's room for some more aggressive steps in the past, and certainly there is now. I think that the political environment has changed to allow more aggressive steps. But I don't want to judge Israel too harshly on this. This is not a case of Israel simply allowing UNRWA to do whatever it wants. It's more a case of Israel's being cautious in a difficult environment.
So let's go back to the laws that have actually been passed before we explore about the question of, let's say, what the international community that's funding UNRWA might consider doing. So the laws have faced some opposition, both internationally and domestically. The outgoing State Department had cautioned the Trump administration that they thought that the implementation of these laws could be catastrophic, for instance. And within Israel, you've had two far-left NGOs that filed suit in the Supreme Court against the laws, challenging them as violative of international law. And of course, again, commenting on the question of a potential humanitarian crisis. So that case is currently in the Israeli Supreme Court. It was not dismissed. And the government is meant to submit some kind of reply in March. What do you say about the issue of these laws and international law, and perhaps about this case specifically, if you know the details?
So, let's start with what does international law have to say about this?
Mm-hmm.
So, Israel's under no duty to cooperate with any particular UN agency unless there is a Security Council resolution under Chapter 7 on the matter, which binds Israel to the executive authority of the UN. Other than that, Israel has no duty to accept these people on its territory. It has no duty to cooperate with them at all. Nonetheless, the argument is made something along these lines. It's claimed that Israel has a responsibility to facilitate humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. And that's partially true. Israel's required to, any party to a conflict is required to facilitate humanitarian aid to civilians unless there is a well-based fear that the aid is going to be diverted to the enemy. In this case, not only is there a well-based fear, it's a certainty that aid that goes into the Gaza Strip ends up in the hands of Hamas. Israel, therefore, is under no legal duty, to facilitate humanitarian aid through UNRWA or anyone else. That said, Israel's foes, including Israel's foes in the Biden administration, have no qualms or had no qualms about nonetheless pushing the Palestinian propaganda line that Israel is required to do so under international law, and any harm that comes to the Palestinians as a result of being used as human shields by Hamas is Israel's fault. And there's a catastrophe happening or about to happen in the Gaza Strip. Just wait, it'll start in 2 minutes, right? If it hasn't started yet. And that's the line that they keep using. That is the line that the left-wing organizations are using in the Israeli Supreme Court, that Israel's legally required to provide aid. And since there are no organizations on the ground in the Gaza Strip that aren't in cooperation with Hamas, and the largest one is UNRWA, they say it has to be done through UNRWA. Right? So you start with a bad assumption and you reach a bad conclusion. But that's not the reality of the international law. Unfortunately, courts don't always rule according to what pure legal analysis would say. There's a political dimension to the way they rule. So I'm not at all confident that the Israeli Supreme Court will throw out these petitions the way it ought to. And I am certain that if it comes before the ICJ will rule against Israel. It has nothing to do with the legal merits. The legal merits are entirely in Israel's favor, and nonetheless, the ICJ will rule entirely against Israel.
So, to a point that you just mentioned, right? You said that you have effectively every organization on the ground in Gaza has to coordinate with Hamas and specifically, but there are other terror organizations there. I think the question arises: let's assume that the laws stay in effect and the laws are finally fully implemented. To your point, there were reports that UNRWA, the Israelis were continuing to coordinate with UNRWA to pass aid into Gaza. Following the 7th, UNRWA apparently handled, but certain reports suggest that it handled up to maybe 40% of the aid. And then within Jerusalem, there are already other organizations that have tried to take over some of the responsibilities. I believe the Palestinian Red Crescent initially won a tender from the Ministry of Health to do that. But of course, it too is a problematic
The Red Crescent also coordinates with the terrorist organizations.
So then the question is, let's assume for a minute UNRWA's out of the picture. What replaces it? Do we find ourselves in the same situation?
Again, replaces it doing what? Right? That is, the duty of Israel to facilitate humanitarian aid is dependent upon it not being diverted. We don't have, at the moment, any organization that's on the ground in the Gaza Strip that's able to do that. I'll add more. I think that Einat Wilf said this. Right? She said, UNRWA is not the firemen. They're the pyromaniac. They're setting the fires. Who replaces them? You don't want to replace them. You want to get the pyromaniacs out of there. You don't want someone new setting fires.
What does it look like?
It's like who's going to replace them in neutrally giving aid? They're not neutrally giving aid to begin with. You don't want them replaced.
Fair point. What happens? What happens next? I'll put it that way. In the best case scenario, what happens next?
Well, here we have a problem again. The problem that we have that has not been resolved and is certainly not resolved by working with UNRWA, is there a way to get humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip without it being diverted by Hamas while the Gaza Strip is still under Hamas control? Now, if there is a way to do that, I haven't yet heard it. I think that the evidence is pretty convincing at this point that there is no way to do that. Right now, what does that mean? It means either you give no aid and hope for the best, or you facilitate the humanitarian evacuation of Gaza civilians so that they can get aid elsewhere outside of the war zone. Now, that apparently is what the Trump administration has proposed, much to the wailing and gnashing of teeth of radical Palestinians and their supporters. But as a humanitarian solution, it seems to me to have the virtue of being actually plausible, as opposed to the wishful thinking, well, let's pretend that Hamas doesn't control the channels of distribution.
All right. Well, that opens up, I think, probably like a dozen new shows in terms of how that can practically happen. So I'm going to refocus us on this, but already I'm inviting you for
I'm accepting your invitation.
Fantastic. So back to UNRWA. You had mentioned that there were lawsuits, civil and criminal lawsuits, I believe, that had been filed against UNRWA. Civil. Against UNRWA employees. And I think also UNRWA USA, its affiliate there, is also been sued. Can you talk more about those cases if you're aware of the details? But even generally, what would you recommend? A lot of this audience is international. What would you recommend at the public level that people try to get their governments to do if they're currently involved with UNRWA, and at the private level, along the lines of these suits or others?
The suits are currently stuck over motions to dismiss on the grounds of UNRWA immunity. And to the degree that someone wants to get involved that's not directly involved in the suit, I think would not be a bad idea to promote legislation that explicitly states that they enjoy no immunity, right? In the United States. If we're talking about in other countries, I think that the same thing should be done, and of course, pressure should be put on the governments to stop funding UNRWA, right? To even to go beyond that, to close up UNRWA's operations. There is no reason for UNRWA to exist today. As far as humanitarian services are concerned, there has to be a way to deliver humanitarian services that doesn't involve funding a barbaric terrorist organization. And if that's the only way to do it, then that's still no excuse. It shouldn't be done. Right? And also, as I said, UNRWA is a political organization whose primary effect under international law is to strip Palestinians of rights, which is insane. Right? Again, the Palestinians, so long as UNRWA exists, Palestinians are denied the benefits of the Refugee Convention. So I'll give you an example. During the civil war in Syria, there were, of course, millions of refugees. They fled south, they fled north. They would get to the border of Jordan, and there were UN personnel there dealing with the refugees. There were personnel from the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, and there were personnel from UNRWA. And the Jordanian position, which is backed up by the UN, was that the Palestinians who are fleeing from Syria are not refugees. They're not covered by the Refugee Convention. The UN High Commissioner of Refugees will not help them. They will not be taken into Jordan. They're going to be sent back into the war zone. And that is what happened. In what must be the irony of ironies, even Human Rights Watch put out a report claiming that Jordan ought not to do this. Right? Like they for 5 seconds they acknowledged the absurdity, right, of the radical anti-Israel movement basically taking steps that are killing Palestinians in the civil war in Syria. No Israelis anywhere near here, right? But that is what UNRWA does. It's in black and white in the first article of the Refugee Convention, and so it's important to shut down the operations. How do you shut down the operations? That is a matter of lobbying. It's a matter of lobbying not only in the United States, but in Germany, in Britain, in France. Right now, some of these states, their governments are so fanatically anti-Israel they won't even consider it for a moment. But some of them you can break through to a portion of the population that is both uninterested in spending tens and hundreds of millions of dollars in this corrupt terrorist supporting operation, and also can see the absurdity of what's being done here, where you're essentially not only hurting Israel, but you're stripping Palestinians of their rights, all in order to carry on this radical political campaign against Israel. And I think that it's possible to get some traction in some Western countries against the continued existence of UNRWA.
One last question.
Yes.
All right. So you're involved with NGO Monitor.
Yes.
Which is, well, you can summarize it probably better than I can, but I'll say that it's done a ton of research on the activities and financing of all sorts of NGOs operating within Israel, often against the interests of the State of Israel. And so I wonder whether there are some broader lessons to draw about the way that Israel itself should be looking at these sort of actors.
There's, in Israel, in some circles...
You can give a bit more background than I did.
Yeah. In Israel, there is an unfortunate tendency to take certain actors at face value, to when they describe themselves, to take their description of what they're supposed to be doing as if it's a description of reality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You mentioned NGO Monitor. I'm on the board of directors, which means I have no role in running NGO Monitor. It's basically, to be in the board of directors means oversight rather than the day-to-day operations, right? So I can't tell you about the day-to-day work of NGO Monitor, and I don't think that anybody in NGO Monitor would want me to represent the organization. But I will tell you that at the core of the organization is an insight that Gerald Steinberg, the president of the organization, had a number of years ago, which is that a large number of NGOs, by virtue of having terms like human rights in their titles, or claiming that that's their goal, enjoy credibility that's unwarranted. There's this halo effect around them, right? We're the good guys. How do you know we're the good guys? Because human rights is in our name, right? And it turns out that when you actually look at what they do, they're not the good guys. They're not protecting human rights. Pardon?
Can you give some examples?
Listen, I've had a lot of encounters over the years with Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch, at least as far as its activity related to Israel is concerned, is more or less pro-terrorist propaganda. That's all it does. It creates reports that make false accusations of Israeli crimes. They know they're false accusations. There's not a bit of evidence behind them, and there's not a bit of legal analysis behind them. But they do this all the time. They do it at times of high conflict. They do this at times of low conflict. They do it all the time. And the people who handle the Israel brief for Human Rights Watch are hired from the activist, radical pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel activist community. And that's what they know. They don't know anything about human rights. They don't care about human rights. What they care about is doing anti-Israel activity. And it's gotten to the point, where one of the senior person on Israeli stuff right these days is a gentleman by the name of Omar Shakir, who is a pro-BDS activist who's been banned by Israel because that's all he does, right? He writes these, or his staff writes learned anti-Israel reports that are basically to give the imprimatur of Human Rights Watch says Israel is bad, right? And unfortunately, in Israel, even though this is a game that we should know very well, these are not pro-human rights organizations. They're anti-Israel organizations that are giving cover to the worst kind of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel propaganda. Nonetheless, there are a number of Israeli bureaucratic actors that feel a need to hold their fire, to interact with these people. And that, I think, is a mistake. When you're talking about Human Rights Watch, you're not talking about the government of Great Britain. Right? You're talking about an organization with a large budget. But its ability to punish Israel for calling out the truth, for pointing out that the emperor has no clothes, is quite limited, and Israel could be much more aggressive in this regard.
I think we're going to cut it there this time. We've opened up a few directions for the future. Really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And encourage the audience to follow along for next week's episode.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us in this discussion. With law and policy as an entry point into the big Israeli conversations today, we have many more topics to explore together in the coming weeks. See you here again soon.